Oh, the promise and the oath you swore have been painted red over my door.
Welcome to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Welcome to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and here we are again. John and Bill, how you guys doing today? Pretty good?
Yeah, pretty good.
Doing well.
Awesome. Well, we are excited. Today is our first Q&A episode. We want to take some time to answer the questions that you have sent in through the website. Just either maybe you know some of us personally and you've asked questions. So we want to try to tackle some of those things. But first, we just want to say thank you to our listeners. We've gotten a bunch of feedback from you through emails, through Twitter, and a lot of your feedback has just been really, really encouraging, really helpful. And it's pretty awesome to hear how many of you have been listening from different parts all around the world. And so, yeah, we're just super excited and super thankful for you, our listeners. So one thing you can do to help us out is you can give us a rating or write a review on whatever platform that you're using to listen to us on. So whether you're on Apple Podcasts, I know that it's easy to kind of give like a ranking there. Like you can give us a number of stars, 1 through 5 stars. We would love to see reviews and ratings, and that really helps in many ways to promote the podcast as well. So leave us a rating or a review on whatever platform you listen to us on.
Yeah, I'd also like to give a shout out and thanks to Luke Wood for letting us use that sweet song in the intro. Luke's a good friend of mine, and we all know Luke. I actually have known Luke since he was born. We grew up in the same small town, and you can look for this. Really, any of Luke's albums, but this latest one is pretty amazing. It basically is. He's working through in lyric and in music a lot of the topics that we're going over here, and he's worked through a lot of these same things for years too. He just goes about it with music. So you can find the album, which is called Here and There. So Luke Wood, Here and There. Spotify, Apple Music, anywhere where you stream your music. And the track is called The Promise and the Oath. So again, really special thanks to Luke for letting us do that. And several people have already asked me about the intro song. And that little snippet that we have is just one little part of a really great album. So you should check it out.
Yeah, agreed. It's awesome. Thank you, Luke. Yeah, it's been amazing to have that as part of our podcast. The other thing we want to bring to your attention, and we've mentioned this before a few times, but we have a website, apocalypticgospel.com, and there you can find a whole bunch of different resources that hopefully will connect you more with Jewish apocalypticism and the viewpoint that we're speaking about here. So a bunch of questions that we've received have to do with some of the resources that we recommend. And so we'll talk about some of those today in our Q&A episode. But the other thing you'll notice on our website is just a list of resources, but as well, each of us, John and Bill and I, have our own YouTube channels where we're making just short YouTube videos about a lot of the same content. And you can find links to those YouTube channels on our website as well. In addition, we've got a contact form that many of you have found. If you have questions or if you have ways that you want to get in touch with us or just encourage us or criticize us, whatever you want to do, there's a contact form there. We don't have the ability to respond to every single thing that you send, but we would love to hear from you. Get in touch with us through our contact form. And finally, our podcast does cost a little bit. We pay website hosting costs and service, podcast service to get this podcast to you and all the different platforms. So if the Lord puts it on your heart to help us with some of those costs, or you've been blessed by the podcast, we would be eternally grateful. So with that said, I say, guys, you want to just jump into our questions? We got a whole bunch we want to tackle here. And yeah, let's do it.
Yep.
Let's do it. So our first question here comes from Aaron. He says, I really don't know how to frame my question, except to say all my life I've really only heard two viewpoints concerning the gospel, Calvinism and Arminianism. Does the apocalyptic view lean toward one of these viewpoints, or would you say that it's independent of these two views?
Yeah, so I'll talk on that one. I went to seminary at the center of the free will universe. We had a life-size statue of John Wesley in the courtyard, and at Asbury Seminary. And so I would say, what's going on in Europe in the 16th, 17th, 18th century revolving around issues of divine foreknowledge and free will, and whether divine foreknowledge is causative or historical, which is kind of the main issue between those two camps, is fairly far removed from what concerns a first century Jew. Of course, there's ideas about that get implied or talked about. I would say first century Jews are fairly, the apocalyptic worldview of first century Judaism probably leaned more towards a monergistic kind of God has determined the end from the beginning. But definitely there's also an emphasis on the coming wrath and to repent and flee from it. And so it's just not a conversation that Jews are having at the time. It's not the main concern. Their main concern is where history is moving, its ultimate end, how the universe is structured, and how things are playing out, basically, according to God's timetable. And so the main themes that they're talking about in first century Judaism are not the themes that Calvinists and Arminianists are arguing over in Europe in the modern age. So
in other words, it's independent, only because it really is talking about different things. So it's kind of importing like a false dichotomy as an overlay over the New Testament, or really over the whole Bible, and it's just not how they would have seen things at all, because those weren't the questions at hand.
Right, I'll get this sometimes where I'll speak at churches and people come up to me afterwards and be like, so you're a dispensationalist because you talk about the future? And I'm like, definitely not. Definitely not. And they're like, wait, but you're not Reformed? Nope, not going there either. And you always get the question, well, like, what camp are you in? And I always just say, well, I'm a historicist. I view the New Testament in light of its historical context primarily, and then work from there. And so it's a different worldview, and it's different issues that they're working through at that time.
Yeah, completely different issues. Absolutely. Awesome. All right. Well, second question here comes from Mike, who says, I've loved the podcast thus far. My question relates to Acts 15. It appears that there are multiple ways that interpreters approach and then apply Acts 15 and the Jerusalem conference. That passage seems to be used by some interpreters to justify a Gentile-centric perspective that dismisses the Jewishness of the gospel, or so it appears. Could you guys maybe share your thoughts about what is and is not going on in Acts 15, and specifically how that relates to Jewish apocalypticism?
I'll take this one because Mike's a friend of mine. Mike, good question, man. Mike is a seminary student at DTS right now. But he says really graciously, the passage seems to be used by some interpreters to justify a Gentile-centric perspective. instead of saying every single one.
Right. Right.
No, but there's some out there that interpret it like a normal human being. It's just definitely the minority.
They're hard to unearth. So, I think, we actually want to do a whole show on Acts 15, or maybe like a series of shows on Acts 15, because it really is important, because it's seen as like, kind of a hinge of, if not just the book of Acts, it's a hinge of the whole apostolic mission. And so it's obviously significant. But
so for our listeners, what's going on in Acts 15? Just as a quick summary, right? So it's Paul comes back, and he says, "Hey, I want to basically tell the apostles in Jerusalem the gospel that I've been presenting to the Gentiles. And in light of that, I mean, is this good? What do we tell the Gentiles as the Jewish apostles get together and say, all right, well, if the Gentiles are turning to the God of Israel, how do we tell them how to live? What should we tell them how to live?" And that's just a quick summary of what's going on there in Acts 15, if you're unfamiliar.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so Paul, Peter, in light of Acts 10 and Cornelius and that scenario. So he comes they come in this little meeting, the Council of Jerusalem, they call it sometimes. And so basically what happens is the point of communicating it is the conclusion, because then the conclusion gets written down and it gets sent out to all these Gentiles that had believed in the message of the apostles, and they're trying to figure out how to tell them to go on from there. And so the point is the conclusion, and so you can see what they're talking about in the conclusion. And so James is like the rest of the apostles, and even Jesus. So they're not, in context to their contemporaries, they are not revolutionaries theologically or culturally. They are holding fast to the straightforward expectation of the prophets, and there were contemporaries who were kind of revolutionaries, but even the innovations of the Pharisees by a lot of people were seen as revolutionary theologically. But see, these guys were kind of traditionalists, and so they, being from the apocalyptic tradition, they formed their worldview in light of concepts like the faithfulness and trustworthiness of God to the covenant, and thus to the words of the prophets. And so great example is the conclusion. And here, I actually didn't have it open. So let's go to Acts 2 just to read, or Acts 15 just to read the conclusion there. So after he hears everything, James stands up and he says in verse 14, "Simeon has related how God first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name." Okay, taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name. "With this, the words of the prophets are in agreement." And then he reads Amos 9, "After these things I'll return, and I'll rebuild the tabernacle of David, which is fallen. I'll rebuild its ruins and restore it, so that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, all of the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who makes these things known from long ago." So the odd thing is that the whole question is, he sets up his reading of the text as being about Gentiles who are called by God's name. And then everybody just takes the first section of it and says he's saying that the Gentile church is the restored tabernacle of David, which is so silly. So the whole point is, restored tabernacle of David, the language is just about a restored temple, restored kingdom of David. It's a straightforward conversation about apocalyptic expectation, right? The kingdom of David fully restored with the Davidic descendant on the throne, and the temple restoration in light of that. But in Amos, it happens so that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who are called by his name. So when he says above, Simeon has related how God first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name. So what he's getting at is in verse 5, when the council starts, some of those of the sect of the Pharisees who had believed, the testimony of the Messiah, they stood up and they said, again, the Pharisees are kind of the innovators. So they're trying to put things together in a way that's a little bit different. It is necessary to circumcise them and to direct them to observe the law of Moses. So what they're talking about, just as a backdrop, a very important one that we'll go into more detail, is not legalism. What they're talking about is actually ethnic conversion, not religious conversion. There's some religious conversion connected to it, but not the way that we would think about it. So the reason he's focusing on Gentiles called by the name of the Lord is because both in the mind of a lot of Jews at the time, and also even in Roman legislation, for a Gentile to circumcise meant to change awkwardly, but somehow this is what it meant, to change their ethnicity to become Jewish. And so the whole contention is that what the prophets envision is Gentiles called by the Lord's name coming to worship him as Gentiles and not as Jews. So they shouldn't circumcise because then they become Jews. And that's not what the prophets envision. So it's a little bit awkward just as a quick statement like that, but we'll get into it more. But definitely what they're not doing is, changing the narrative. They're definitely not overturning, the Jewish expectation and realizing whatever. It basically is a conversation, and obviously, if they've sat down recently with the Messiah for 40 days, and he's laid these things out for them, and there's still awkwardness involved, there's a reason why there's still awkwardness. And so they're just navigating this issue of Gentiles remaining Gentiles while clinging to the God of Israel, waiting for his son from heaven. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I would say what normally happens is people read verse 15 and they hear, with this, the words of the prophets are fulfilled, and they quote
Right.
Amos 9. And so that's how, rather than this is the prophets agree with what's happening, and their point is that there's going to be Gentiles in the age to come in the restoration of the Davidic kingdom. So why are we forcing the Gentiles to become Jews now if they're going to be saved from the wrath to come as Gentiles? And that's the question in verse 1 is the believers from the Pharisaical sect say, unless you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved, parentheses, from the wrath to come. So the whole conversation is the coming day of God, the day of wrath, and how to be saved from the wrath to come and inherit the resurrection and eternal life in the age to come when the Messiah comes and restores the kingdom to Israel. And so they're just saying, look, these Gentiles have received the Spirit as the guarantee of their resurrection as Gentiles. So God has shown his favor on them that they will be saved from the wrath to come. So why are we forcing them to be Jews? And it agrees with the prophets that there's going to be Gentiles in the age to come as Gentiles. So let's not force them to become Jews.
Yeah. That's good, guys. That's good. I can't wait till we get into this in our in a future episode. I love how verse 5 of Acts 15, just as a total side note, and then we'll jump into our next question. This just confounds kind of maybe the modern perspective of what people have about the Pharisees, because, it says some believers who belong to the party of the Pharisees, and it makes you go, oh my gosh, believers, Pharisees, and the average evangelical goes, what? I thought Pharisees were unbelievers. I thought they hated God.
Those were the two main categories in the Bible. Believers and Pharisees.
Right. Right. So, well, we're going to talk about more of that, I'm sure, when we get to our episode on Acts 15. But let's jump into our next question. This one comes from Emily, who says, in watching the Bible Project video on heaven and earth, I noticed that they drew it as two different circles. Would you say that a more accurate way to show these circles is that they remain side by side from Genesis 1? It's just that the human access or bridge between heaven and earth that was broken at the fall and will be restored in Revelation?
Yeah. So the Bible Project video on heaven and earth, I would just say that Jews in the first century didn't view the universe as two separate circles.
Right.
This would be the Greek view of the universe as split into two parts. Now, granted, there are, based in Genesis 1:1, the heavens and the earth, and so there's two kind of different components of the universe, but they didn't view them as distinct circles. So there was a plurality of heavens, more than one, and the earth below, and God ruling in the height of the heavens. So when I wrote that chapter in my book, chapter 2 on the heavens and the earth, that wasn't just me kind of thinking out a diagram. It was how my best reconstruction of how the Bible and alongside with Jews at the time viewed the makeup of creation. And so they viewed a plurality of heavens, some 3, 5, 7, or 10, with the earth beneath, and it's one cohesive reality in which the Lord travels up and down through the heavens. He comes down to view things. People are taken up, like Enoch and Elijah, and in the second temple period, you have a lot of reflection particularly on Enoch and his journey. So Second Enoch, for example, is probably the most pronounced book in the Second Temple period on the heavenly travels. And so if you're familiar with Second Enoch, it's a great example of how they viewed the universe. And so in that, Enoch has a dream. The book is divided into the first 22 chapters, which is Enoch's heavenly travel. And then the last 50 chapters of Second Enoch is just ramblings about that and the future and the universe and the calendar and Torah observance, and it's just random. But so the first 22 chapters, the chapters are fairly short. Enoch has a dream in chapter 1, and then in chapter 3, he's taken up to the first heaven, and he sees the stars and the angels that are in charge of the stars and the heavenly treasuries. Then in chapter 7, he's taken up to the second heaven, where people are being held for the coming judgment. And then in chapter 8, he's taken up to the third heaven, where he says, I looked down and I saw paradise, and that place is inconceivably pleasant, full of trees and flowers and fruit, and in the midst of them was the tree of life. So, you get a lot of, when Enoch was in the third heaven, it's similar to Paul's discussion in 2 Corinthians 12 of the third heaven. Now, whether Paul had other heavens in mind, I don't know, but the language is very similar. And then he goes on in chapter 11. He's taken up to the fourth heaven, where he sees the sun and the moon and the gates that the sun and the moon go in and out of. And there's a lot on that. He spends like 7 chapters working through the paths and the gates of the sun and the moon and how that relates to the calendar, because Jews are very concerned with how the calendar is being worked out, because that's the basis of a lot of the Torah observance and how you celebrate the Sabbath and the festivals and all of that. So there's a lot that goes in there. And then in chapter 18, he's taken up to the 5th heaven, and there he sees the armies of heaven, the angels, many of which fell. And there's a bit on the Nephilim there in Genesis 6, which I'm not sure how Enoch saw that before it happened, but whatever. And then in chapter 19, he's taken up to the 6th heaven, where he sees the glorious angels with archangels, and he sees 7 phoenixes and 7 cherubim and 7 6-winged beings who are singing in unison, unending. And then in chapter 20, he's taken up to the 7th heaven, where he sees fiery armies led by the archangels. And there's a bit of that, how that goes on. And then in chapter 22, the end of the heavenly travel, he's taken up to the face, the kind of edge of the 10th heaven. And there he sees God Almighty. And it says, there I saw, with a view, the face of the Lord like iron made burning hot in the fire. And the face of the Lord is not to be talked about. It is so marvelous and supremely awesome and supremely frightening. So and that concludes, he goes on a little bit, but that kind of concludes his heavenly travel. And so it's a plurality of heavens that the universe is made of. And the 2 circles diagram just doesn't really help. Now, when you get into the New Testament, and most of the time, you still have the heavens referenced in the plural form, but you also have it like in Revelation 21, where it's heaven and earth in the singular form. And that, I would say, is not a redefinition of the universe, but simply a collective singular in which they're just speaking of all that which is above. Now, a couple places, particularly in Matthew 6 and in 2 Corinthians 5, you get both the plural and the singular used together, which is really interesting. So the Lord's Prayer, for example, our Father who is in the heavens, plural, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, singular. And so the question is, well, why the difference in the plural and the singular? And I would say that they have a view of God ruling in the height of the heavens, but there is conflict in the heavens with the angels, but the will of the Lord is done, like with Enoch in the 2nd and 5th heavens, you have rebellion going on in 2nd Enoch, but there's no rebellion once you get up to the 7th and 10th heaven, or I guess in the 3rd. I don't even know how that all works. I'm not saying I understand the structure of the universe. I haven't been there. I don't know. But the idea is that there are places where God is, where there is no rebellion. And so their prayer for the Lord's Prayer is just the prayer for the coming of the day of God, and that the earth would be as it is in the height of the heavens, where the throne of God is, and that creation would be restored to its original order without the rebellion. That was a little bit drug on, but the Bible Project gives me a headache sometimes, because I'm really not sure if they've ever read anything that Jews wrote at the time. Particularly their episodes on the Apocalyptic is painful to watch.
Yeah.
Well, let me take a stab at a question. So this is from Ross. So after reading John's book, watching and listening to this podcast and other movies, i.e. Enduring Witness and the Jewish Eschatology and Gentile Discipleship Seminar, the one that John recently did with Joel Richardson, I will have to say this is the most influential time of study I have ever had. At this point, I cannot see myself discipling without this being the main thrust. With that said, how do you disciple people on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, Ross, that is just such a good question. And I think it's just so encouraging to see that you can't see yourself discipling folks without the day of the Lord and the age to come and the larger Jewish apocalyptic framework of the scriptures really being the main thrust. And that is just awesome. Not just because it's the subject of our podcast, but because it's the way that the apostles worked, because discipleship really is contingent upon where things are moving. Like we've talked about in some of our past episodes, I think that eschatology is the driver for discipleship. And in other words, just our view of the future determines how we live in the present. And so when the future that the Bible holds out, when that future is unclear and undefined, and like when the day of judgment and the age to come is just fuzzy, or it's just about going to heaven to play a harp on a cloud, or just generically, oh, God loves you and has a great plan for your life if you pray a prayer. No wonder why it's so hard for someone to find, that motivation to fight against the lust of the flesh over and over and over and over again for decades. And so, Ross, what you're discovering is that the scriptures just make it really, really simple, that the more clarity that someone has about the future, specifically the future that Jesus and the apostles held to, that it makes far more sense to walk in obedience and to put to death the deeds of the flesh in this present evil age so that you can actually get the prize of the resurrection in the age to come. So, like if there's no immorality in the age to come and God's going to throw those who practice immorality into a lake of fire on the day of judgment, I mean, that's far more concrete and motivating to stop living immorally today than just to tell someone, oh, well, he really loves you and just doesn't like it when you live in immorality, right? So, right. And I think the other point that I'll make is that discipleship for a Jew in the first century was much more, what's a good word? Maybe invasive or disruptive to someone's life than just kind of meeting up once a week to get some coffee and talking about how your quiet times have been. Right? I mean, not that that's bad or wrong, but that's just not what Peter or Paul or John, whatever, understood as discipleship. And I think for them, it involved learning a particular teacher's interpretation of the law and the prophets and then conforming their lifestyle to accord with that teaching. And I think, as we've mentioned before, maybe just a better way to understand Jesus' words to the apostles in the Great Commission would be to go and school the Gentiles, like to teach them to walk and live in a certain way based on Jesus' understanding of the law and the prophets. Because there's something way bigger at stake than a good quiet time, right? It's called eternal life and the resurrection. Yeah. So for me, I think your question is dear to me because discipleship is what I get to do full time with college students here in Texas as a college pastor. And practically speaking, I've just seen so much fruit come from simply walking through the biblical storyline and just giving students context and history and helping them to understand the big themes of the covenants, the two-age framework, the apocalyptic view held by Jews in the first century, Jesus and the apostles, and really just encouraging them to, as Paul would say in Romans 13, to cast off the works of darkness and to walk properly as in the daytime, or as Peter says in 1 Peter 1, to set their hope fully on the day the Messiah returns and reigns from Jerusalem, and just not to worry about their life. I mean, college students feel like they have so much to deal with, like their future spouse, their career, their projects and their exams, and so many things that just press upon them that so weigh them down. But just to encourage them not to worry and to devote themselves to the teachings of Jesus and the apostles and to allow the Holy Spirit to stir them to repentance in areas of disobedience so that they can even be more clear and more bold as a witness for the day of the Lord in the age to come. Yeah. So, yeah, for some students, this means meeting up once a week, but doing far more than giving them tips for a better quiet time, but actually opening up the door to the larger storyline of Scripture and encouraging them to live in that narrative, not the narrative of the American dream or the typical comfortable Western Christian lifestyle. So yeah, I hope that that's helpful.
Yeah, and I think of like 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul says, What I mean, brothers, the appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, those who mourn as though they are not mourning, those who rejoice as though they're not rejoicing, those who those who rejoice as though they're not rejoicing. That's kind of dark. And those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of the world is passing away. And so I think of like day-to-day discipleship as discipling people to deal with their life, both the positives and the negatives, in light of the age to come. So most of us are dealing with a lot of negatives. Everybody has problems in their life and issue and brokenness and everything else. And so like 2 Corinthians 4, Paul's relating of his negatives in life. He says, therefore we don't lose heart, because our light and momentary afflictions are storing up for us an eternal weight of glory that is incomparable. And so day to day, discipling people is when they come to you, especially, if you're a pastor, you understand people come to you nonstop with their problems and their issues and their conflicts and la-da-da-da-da. It just goes on and on. And how do you disciple? You disciple by framing with grace and love those issues and negative aspects of life in light of the age to come. Like 1 Corinthians 6, you guys are suing each other and taking each other to court. Don't you know you're going to judge angels? Like, you can't work it out. The small stuff in this life, you can't work it out in light of that. And then also the positive things, those who rejoice as though they're not rejoicing, meaning things are going awesome for you. Life is prosperous. You're being promoted in your work, you're being promoted in your position, in your influence. Then put it in light of the resurrection and age to come. Praise God for it, but don't get bloated or start to think more of yourself or whatever. And it sets things in context, and you don't end up like in 1 Peter saying, oh, we'll just go to this city and make money and go to the next city. It's like, no, put your life and your successes in context to the reality of history, the present evil age, and the coming judgment. Yeah. And like 1 Timothy 6, tell those who are rich to store up for themselves, to be generous and store up for themselves for the coming ages. And so these are some of the, I think, kind of day-to-day is teaching people how to understand their life and all the things that happen in light of the age to come.
Yeah, just wrestling yourself back to that simple timeline of this age and the age to come, and putting life in that context and realizing, okay, things may be awesome, things may be not so awesome today, but where is this going? And actually letting the age to come, the day of the Lord, the resurrection, be the anchor that we cling to, even in the highs and the lows of this age. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's good.
Well, next question comes from Christopher John, who says, what does Second Temple writing tell us about Paul's use of all Israel in Romans 11:26?
I'll jump on that one. So, this is obviously seen, generally speaking, it's on a more popular level, it's seen in two different ways. It's either seen as every Jew gets saved, or that all Israel, like N.T. Wright, all Israel is actually somehow a reference to the Christian church. That's pretty magical to be able to pull that off.
So before you jump in and actually talk about that, Bill, let me just read the passage real quick. Okay, so this is Romans 11:25 and 26. It says, lest you be wise in your own sight, I don't want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers, that a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins.
all Israel is saved. So who is all Israel who's saved? And so, like I said, usually, it's every Jew, or it's all the Christians that have to become Christians will become Christians. Again, N.T. Wright is like a magician. But so it likely actually is related to the, as I understand how goofy this conversation gets these days with like the two-house movement and things like that in the Hebrew roots. But it's still likely not related to those movements, but rather to certain movements within Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic literature. It's probably actually more related to the 10 lost tribes, or let's just say the lost tribes, because sometimes they were 9, not 10. But so the expectation, the easiest place, to take it from is Ezekiel 37. So right after the Valley of Dry Bones and the resurrection, which is it's like the resurrection is placed together with the final restoration to the land of Israel, if you read in Ezekiel 36, 37. But immediately in that context, there's also a prophecy of grab 2 sticks, right? Judah on one of them and Ephraim on the other, I think it is, and so that I'll join them together. In context to the resurrection, they will be joined together, and I'll bring all of them back to the land again, and they'll live together as one tribe. So all of the ones that have left before and Judah will all come back together, and they'll live together as one people in the land of Israel. And so that is, kind of like we just read in Acts 15, where there's the anticipation in the prophets of Gentiles coming to worship God and to bring tribute to Him on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And so they go, well, how do we accommodate this theologically? And so the same conversation is happening here, where like in and the language, you can find it for the 10 lost tribes. All Israel is in the Testament of Reuben, from the Testament of the 12 patriarchs, which is Second Temple, a Jewish writing or Jewish/Christian writing. All Israel is basically means all 12 tribes. And so the expectation gets played forward like in Second Esdras, passages like Second Esdras and other places. It gets played forward like Second Esdras 13. There's a vision of a man and 2 multitudes. If you ever read it, so there's a man. The first multitude's aggressive, and he's on like Mount Zion. And he kills them with the breath of his mouth, with fire coming forth from his mouth, and he kills the aggressive multitude. And then a gentle multitude follows him, a peaceful multitude follows him up to Mount Zion. And then the interpretation is that this is the restoration of the tribes that were lost, so that Judah and Israel and all the other tribes of the northern kingdom come back with this person who's said to be the Son of God a little bit later on.
Right. So just to jump in there, Bill, sorry. He specifically says in chapter 13, which is Ezra's 6th vision of the man coming out of the sea, it says, "And Zion will come and be made manifest to all people, prepared and built as you saw the mountain carved out without hands." So, an allusion to Daniel 2. "And he, my son, will reprove the assembled nations for their ungodliness, and will reproach them to their face with their evil thoughts and with torments, for which they will be tormented. And as for your seeing him gathered to himself another multitude which was peaceful, these are the 10 tribes which were led away from their own land into captivity in the days of King Hoshea, whom Salmanasar, the king of the Assyrians, led captive. He took them across the river, and they were taken into another land." And then he goes on for a while. So it's not it's not like a vague allusion. It's a real specific theology around God made covenant with this man, Abraham. It's an everlasting covenant, and that has to play out to its final conclusion, which means the 12 sons of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes must be restored in their fullness at the end of the age. So you have a real idea of these 10 lost tribes. God will ultimately restore that reality at the end of the age.
Right.
And so that's where you get the language of the angels going out from the four corners and gathering in those from the lost tribes to the restored kingdom idea.
Yeah, and I was trying to go a little quicker, but that you're right. That deserves special mention. The Testament of Joseph also has similar vision where it's just really short, where there's 12 what later are called lambs, but 12 lambs on this mountain grazing, and then they're all scattered, and then 3 of them come back, which that's a fairly common way to do it. It's either 10 and 2 or it's 9 and 3, because sometimes it's Benjamin, Judah, and Levi who are the separate ones. And so that 3 of them come back, or they cry out to God, and he brings them back to the mountain to graze, and then they cry out, and God responds and brings the other 9 back to graze as well. So, there's like John said, this is a real thing. It's not used the way it's used today. Like on a popular level right now, these are conversations that are related to silly discussions about, Hebrew roots conversations. But this was like a big, you can see if you read Ezekiel 37, again, I just glossed over it because I didn't want to spend the time. But this is like a big deal. And Ezekiel 37 kind of creates it's like the main place where you get the expectation from the prophets. But again, like John connected, it's really with the promise to Abraham. And then you see it played, it's funny because Jesus references it so effortlessly as though everybody knows what he's talking about. But if you remember that we're talking about like 700 years since they've heard from the 10 tribes, it's fairly radical for Jesus just to say, like in Matthew 19, verse 28, "Truly I say to you that you who have followed me in the regeneration when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you also will sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So assuming that everybody knows that in the regeneration or the restoration, that the 12 tribes will be there. God will restore them all, and they're going to need leaders, and God's going to appoint these guys over them. So it's fairly common at the time, so that Jesus can reference it like that, and it's later on in the rabbis there's with the rabbis with everything, there's an argument about if the 10 tribes are coming back, but generally it's a fairly well known expectation in light of Genesis 12 and the words to Abraham, and Ezekiel 37, and the anticipation of the 2 rods being joined in light of the resurrection and the restoration of Israel at the end of the age. So that's where you get the language of all Israel that Paul seems to be incorporating into the narrative of Gentiles being joined into the hope of Israel. The Gentiles are being added, but it's basically all unto this narrative of the people of Israel being restored to the land in the age to come. And so he's kind of referencing that whole narrative with the all Israel stuff.
And I think as equally pertinent to all Israel being saved is the fullness of the Gentiles, that Paul in his world viewed the Gentiles as 70 distinct entities that are derived from the table of nations.
Right.
And so James Scott did a fantastic book on Paul and the Gentiles. I forget the exact name on it, where he basically
remapping the apostles' convictional world.
Right, where he basically outlines the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple literature, and just shows how Jews understood the world according to the Table of Nations, and it's basically broken into 3 chunks, and it's a circle surrounding Jerusalem, and so there's 70 distinct families, and that's pretty much what Paul has in mind when he's, talking about the fullness or the full number of the Gentiles from the 70 nations coming in, and then the 12 tribes will be restored. So you got kind of 82 distinct entities in mind in Romans 11:26 that Paul is playing the two off of each other, that God has ordained the boundaries of the 70 families, and he's ordained the 12 tribes, and he's going to bring the Gentiles to fullness in this age, and then the restoration of Israel, and all will be brought to completion in the end. And so all Israel being saved is really just a generic reference to Jewish eschatology, rather than some specific, whether it's the 2-house weirdness out of the Hebrew roots, or it's like some sort of strange dispensational dissection of who's alive through the tribulation, then how they get saved or when they get saved and what's the number. And it's just like, why? No, what are you talking about it?
Right.
It's just talking about the day of God, and Jesus is going to return. He's going to come from Zion, like Paul quotes in Isaiah 59. And what God is doing now, assigning the Jews to disobedience like the Gentiles were assigned to disobedience, so that he might have mercy on them all at the judgment seat of God. And he's granting mercy and fullness to the Gentiles until the words come to pass and the prophetic witness is shown to be true. And so I think that's all that's going on in Romans 11.
That's good. One quick note. John mentioned the book if you're looking for it. He said Paul and the Gentiles, so that's the other book that we really like by Donaldson.
By Terrence
He meant
Donaldson,
Paul and the Nations.
Paul and the Nations,
yeah,
that's right.
Paul and the Nations, the Old Testament and early Jewish background. Yeah, so 2 great books, but he was referencing James Scott, Paul and the Nations, unfortunately much more difficult to get a hold of than Paul and the Gentiles.
If you have a theological seminary around, it'll have it there.
Right.
Yeah.
Great, guys. Well, I think we've got time for maybe 2 more questions here. Let's tackle this next one. So this is from Josh. Love your name, Josh. This isn't from me, but this is from another Josh, who says, this podcast, John's book, and your YouTube videos have all been incredibly clarifying for me. Since the view you promote is apparently a minority among Christian publishers, most of which is dominated by the Reformed-ish world, I was wondering if you, along with your current list of resources, that you could recommend commentaries on each book of the Bible that you found helpful.
This is difficult.
It is.
In the next 60 seconds.
Yeah.
To describe the relationship between Reformed, historical, evangelical, Wesleyan, dispensational scholars and their publishing houses, and how just generally speaking, I'll just say a few remarks on commentaries. So generally speaking, I find that historical critical commentaries are helpful in the New Testament and annoying on the Hebrew Bible, whereas evangelical commentaries are helpful on the Hebrew Bible and annoying in the New Testament. And so usually I just stick with your main evangelical commentaries when it comes to the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, and then I generally tend to lean towards historical ones. You can go to bestcommentaries.com. That website is super helpful as far as a listing of all the main commentaries, what kind of commentary they are, technical, devotional, pastoral, etc., and what their rating is. Now, like the question says, like you say, it has a reformed bias. I mean, Don Carson,
Big
anything
time.
Don Carson
Yep.
writes is like number one
Yep.
on there. even the commentary on Matthew, he comes in number one. And from the EBC, I'm just like, you have got to be kidding. And he's, but whatever. Generally speaking, it's a fairly good gauge of which commentaries are well written, well cited, informative, helpful. As far as, but I definitely wouldn't agree with, especially when you come to the New Testament commentaries, their kind of ranking. So just a few examples, rankings. So for a few examples, like the book of Matthew, I would tend to lean towards Davies and Allison's commentary out of the ICC.
It's the best.
It is. It's pretty awesome. John Nolan's from the NIGTC is also, I like. As far as evangelical commentaries on Matthew, Craig Blumberg, the New American, is okay. For the book of Mark, I would actually go with the Hermeneia, Adela Collins, John Collins' wife. Her commentary on Mark is fairly solid. Or Joel Marcus from the Anchor Bible commentary. For Mark, Craig Evans, his commentary, as far as evangelicals go, that would be, his is not bad from the Word Biblical commentary. On Luke, John Nolan is about the only one I can stomach on Luke. Darrell Bach's commentary is good. There's just particular things, his approach. There's baggage.
Yep.
And definitely run screaming from Joel Green's commentary and the Nikent. The Gospel of John is difficult just because it's the Gospel of John's complicated. Don Carson's commentary is okay, but he is relentless in realized eschatology.
Yeah.
The critical scholars, the Gospel of John's a little bit like Old Testament. You know, the critical scholars eat it alive, and they don't apply Jewish apocalyptic to it, and the evangelicals eat it alive and apply realized eschatology to it, and it's like, so Herman Ritterbos actually did a commentary on the Gospel of John that is not bad, but John's kind of a headache. So I won't go through all the New Testament books, but that gives you a little bit of a feel of kind of how to weed through. You're not going to find one commentary set that's going to, answer all your questions. But bestcommentaries.com is a solid place to start.
Good. Okay, I'm going to read the last one here. Josh, why don't you take this one? This one is from Hunter. What you talk about on this podcast sounds good and makes so much sense when you read the Bible through a first century Jewish apocalyptic lens. But I want to ask, why are these things never talked about in churches? If it's really this important, don't you think pastors should be telling their congregations about the day of the Lord and helping them hope in the age to come? Josh, what do you think?
Well, Hunter, yes, of course. The answer is yes. Yes, we do believe that pastors should be telling their congregations about the day of the Lord and about the age to come as Jesus and the apostles would have understood it. But, it's a great question because I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why Jewish apocalyptic isn't talked about in your typical Western church. So I'll just give a few off the top of my head. I think first, I would think that there are historical reasons. Like you can actually trace the distortion of thought and theology throughout Western history. And it's Like, have you guys ever played that game Telephone when you were a kid, right? Everyone sits in a circle and, you say something and then you pass it on to your friend and they pass it on and they pass it on and they pass it on. And so it's like if someone says orange juice and then it gets passed down like the line in a whisper until you get to the last person and they say, I wore red shoes or something like that, right? And so it's like the first thing doesn't really have anything to do at all with the last thing that was said. So it's kind of like that from the first century onward. You get Origen and Augustine, and the conversation with those guys had already shifted away from a Jewish Messiah reigning in Jerusalem to this spiritual vision of an ethereal heavenly city. And then you get the Constantinian shift, and then all the way through the Dark Ages and the Crusades, and you get a ton of supersessionism and anti-Semitism. And then you kind of come up to Luther and Calvin in the Reformation. And so the conversation at that point, as we've already mentioned, is about so many other things like free will and grace and works. And then you even get into the modern day where there's been a resurgence of historical studies, like through guys like Ed Sanders and Jimmy Dunn and N.T. Wright and Paula Fredrickson. But with all of that said, Western evangelicalism finds a lot of its theological roots in the Protestant Reformation from the 16th century. So like the days of Luther and Calvin. So, your typical Baptist church isn't going to be talking a lot about the day of the Lord or the age to come or the restoration of the kingdom to Israel. So I think depending upon your church's tradition or denomination, your game of telephone, I think, might stop somewhere in the middle of the circle. Or maybe it'll go all the way to the end, but historically speaking, the apostles were saying different things, or at least putting their emphasis, as we mentioned earlier in this episode, putting their emphasis on different things than modern evangelicalism does today. And I think it's worth mentioning too that maybe another part of the Western church that for sure is worth mentioning is rooted in the Pentecostal and charismatic renewal movements of like the early 20th century and, the late 70s and early 80s. And so their focus is on more of the gifts of the Spirit, prophecy, tongues, healing, etc. And so with that, I suppose you could add another reason why Jewish apocalyptic really isn't talked about in the typical Western church is because there's maybe this aversion in evangelicalism to anything that's complicated or theological. And so the idea that historical studies and academia that looks at how the apostles would have understood ideas like the kingdom or the Messiah or the day of judgment or Gehenna, the lake of fire, those things are quote unquote too complex, really for the average believer to understand, or maybe the accusation is it doesn't really bear fruit in someone's life when they study it, or they're just being legalistic or whatever. And so the reasoning goes, well, we just need to know about Christ and him crucified, like Jesus and the cross and stuff. But I think in my 16 years of full-time ministry, I found that the opposite is true, especially in my own life, that the more that I understand the world of Jesus and the apostles, like the simpler the message of the gospel actually becomes. And as we've said before, I think the gospel as a first century Jew would have understood it. It isn't complex, but what's hard about it is actually walking it out and actually relying on God and putting to death the deeds of the flesh and truly obeying the words of Jesus. So yeah, all these things should absolutely be talked about. I think, and I mean, you just got to think about your average pastor, though, who's under so much stress, like he's got to deal with the sound system breaking and the two couples in his congregation whose marriage is on the rocks and the rebellious kid in the youth group. And, all the while he's trying to lead his own family and then he's trying to prepare a sermon on Sunday morning that'll hopefully encourage the people. And that's not the ideal setting to talk about history. And I get it. It's tough, but that's the goal of our podcast, like the goal of our individual YouTube videos, the friends in ministry that we have and love, like Joel Richardson and others. We want to help others persevere on the narrow path that leads to life. And so, yeah, talk about this stuff. Even if your church doesn't necessarily focus on it, that doesn't mean you shouldn't, right? Get a small group together, study together, encourage one another, pray for one another, boldly tell others about this. Just because your church doesn't talk about it doesn't mean that you shouldn't.
That's good.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, you have just the practicality of what happens in the trickle-down effect. So all of these ideas are happening in the academy, in training institutions, seminaries, Bible colleges. And so you're dealing with the bias there at those institutions, particularly in the evangelical world. But then you're dealing with, the 2 times I was at seminaries, at training institutions, the vast majority of the people who are going to school have their own lives. They've got kids, they've got another job on top of they're doing seminary full time. And most of the people I knew never actually read the books. They just showed up, they absorbed the lectures, they kind of skimmed the books, they churned out some papers, they got a certificate, and then they moved on into ministry. The people that actually read the books, those are the people that went on to do doctoral work and teach in the seminary. So you get this kind of, the ideas get stuck in the academic world. They don't trickle down very well. Most people, there's a bias against it, and then they don't actually pick up that much in seminary, and then they move on into ministry, and it's just kind of, it's background information that maybe you'll mention if it's pertinent to a sermon, but usually not really, and it just becomes a haze long in the past in the background. And, I've talked to pastors before, and they're like, oh yeah, this is, talking to you is bring me back to when I was in seminary. And it's like, yeah, well, yeah, should just bring you back to the Bible, man. I don't know what to tell you. So there's a lot of different dynamics that go into why you don't hear about it in churches. But like Josh said, that's our goal, is to try to get the trickle down to happen and to root out a little bit of the bias against Jewish apocalyptic thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like Josh finished up with, I think that's a big point, because I've both been involved with a lot of conversations with pastors, and I've worked with other people that have been in conversations with pastors, and there's always a variety of responses, right? But what is almost universal is none of them have actually considered most of the ideas, and that's because either they, like John said, they just couldn't give everything in seminary, or really, if you went to seminary in the last 20 years, if you went to an evangelical seminary, you were kind of given an immunization to apocalyptic ideas.
Yeah.
So because they started to incorporate some of the language of apocalyptic, because they couldn't not do it anymore, but then they kept utilizing new and more sophisticated mechanisms to explain away the actual concepts being influential in the New Testament. And so they've basically they don't know. They've never heard it. So this is why. It's not like there's a conspiracy to hide it from their people. I mean, generally they don't know. So it is, I agree, definitely be patient with your pastor. And but by all means, be willing to sit down and chat and not to, show him where he's wrong, but if you want to have the conversation, and I think that's a fair thing to do it with the spirit of humility, though. But we do hope, like even in doing this, it's slightly above an entry level, like a popular level book. Our podcast would be slightly above that, and it's really written either to like a real Bible student or to somebody who's active in the ministry right now. And so I think this would be something good for folks like that to dive into, which I've had some feedback already from people who are currently active in ministry in pastoral roles, and they've said it's been really helpful for them. So yeah, that's good stuff, Josh.
Yeah. Well, we love your feedback, listeners. We want to hear from you. We want to hear how you've been encouraged, how you've been challenged. And so, please use the contact form on our website. Let us know, follow us on Twitter as well. We typically post some content either from our individual Twitter accounts. We'll kind of retweet that on our podcast Twitter account. So connect with us in whatever ways you can. We'd love to hear from you. of how the Lord is using this podcast. But, well, I'd say we're out of time for today, guys. I think it's been great to tackle some of your questions. To our listeners, thanks for listening. Continue to send in your questions. We're actually going to be doing a few different things on our podcast in the coming episodes. One of the things we've talked about, we want to be able to post some different sermons that or just individual teachings that we think would be helpful to you, our listeners. So something that John or Bill or myself may have done individually in the different ministry contexts that we have, something that's been helpful maybe for our small assemblies or congregations or the people that we are in direct contact with. And those things have been recorded. And so we'll occasionally be posting some of those things here on our podcast to encourage our listeners. But we certainly will continue with our regular episodes as well, and occasionally throw in Q&A episodes like this. So as questions come up, again, feel free to submit them through our website, and we would absolutely love to hear from you. So, well, thanks for joining us today, John and Bill. Great to be with you guys again. God bless you all, and thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. Maranatha.
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 Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.